Welcome to Disney Coast to Coast, a show celebrating and questioning one of the most beloved entertainment companies in the world through honest, passionate, and clear-eyed Disney discussions. I'm Jeff DePauli, your entertainment-obsessed host with rose-colored glasses removed. Today on the show, I'm chatting with Tom Morris, who is an Imagineer for well over 30 years. He started working for the Walt Disney Company as a balloon seller at Disneyland, which eventually led him to working on a whole slew of projects, including the opening of Epcot, the opening of Disneyland Paris, and the opening of Hong Kong Disneyland. When Tom began his work in Imagineering, then WED Enterprises, he was working alongside some of the Disney legends that helped create Disneyland. Plus, considering Tom's long tenure with the company, he worked with quite a few different sets of management and corporate leaders at Imagineering and the Walt Disney Company. Listen as he shares his honest thoughts and stories about all of that. Plus, if you've ever enjoyed riding a roller coaster with synchronized sound, you have Tom to thank for that. Enjoy my conversation with Imagineer Tom Morris.
Prepare for some insight. You've tuned in to an exclusive DCTC interview.
Tom, welcome to Disney Coast to Coast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you, and I'm going to start with a story that I know you've told a billion times, but it's just like the perfect story to introduce you, and that is, long before you were an Imagineer, you had a goal of being at Walt Disney World for the opening of Walt Disney World. True or false?
It's true, and I actually haven't told it a billion times. I've told it recently.
Okay.
It's kind of a recent thing because I kept the story to myself for the majority of my career. And it really wasn't, it was kind of out of mind for quite a long time until really the 50th anniversary of Walt Disney World. It kind of started to surface again. And some people started to uncover, news articles about it and publicity photos. And it's like, are you the same Tom Morris that this person is?
So let's tell the story quickly. You were young. You were like, what, 12?
Yeah, I was 12.
Living in California.
Yeah. And I wanted to go to Disney World on opening day because, I knew I was never going to be able to go to Disneyland on opening day. So in my mind, it was the last and only chance to ever go to a Disneyland type park on its opening day. Because who would have thought there would have been, others?
Well, who would have thought there would have been others, but then who would have thought that you would have been opening them yourself?
Right, exactly. So, I just didn't want to be when I started at Imagineering, I just didn't want to be the little boy who flew to Disney World. So I just never told anybody. Yeah, so Tony Baxter eventually found out about it because he was going through some of his old clip files and came across some articles from, the AP and UPI that, had my interview in it. And so he came into work one day and he said, this is you, right? Because you're from Newport. He knew I was from Newport. And I'm like, yeah, that was me.
But here's the thing that people listening haven't learned yet. You went alone, right? This isn't like your parents took you. You went as a 12-year-old boy. Yeah. Alone. That's how determined you were. So how did that even work out? Well,
I had saved up money to do it from a paper route. So I had the financial means to do it. And, I didn't know that, I guess I wasn't aware that it was such a weird thing to go across country alone. To me, that wasn't, I don't know why it wasn't weird. It was scary. It was, to me, it was scary just because I had never been on a plane before. I had never been that far away from home before. I had assumed I was going to be joined at some point by some friends who we had all, a group of about 4 of us, I think, had talked about this. But then, eventually, one by one, the other friends dropped out. And I couldn't convince my parents to go because they were working, But what saved the day was that on my paper route was a very important Disney executive named Jack Sayers, who was in charge of lessee and corporate alliances. And he was going back and forth like every other week. And just a few weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks before October 1st, I mentioned to him when I was collecting money for my paper route that I was going to Disney World. I don't think I knew that at that moment that he was with Disney. I just mentioned that he said he needed a stop delivery starting September 30th because he and his wife are going to be out of town. And I said, well, I'm going to be out of town too, so I'll let my substitute know. And he said, well, where are you going? And I said, well, I think I'm going to Disney World. And he said, well, that's where I'm going. And so we got to talking, and he made some phone calls the next day and arranged for me to be picked up. He also called my parents. I know he had a conversation with either my mom and dad or both, and assured them that there would be someone taking care of me. I'd be picked up at the airport, dropped back off at the airport. I'd be in good hands while I'm out there. And my parents also, my uncle and aunt were living in Atlanta on business temporarily at the time. And so they made arrangements for me to fly from Orlando to Atlanta that evening of October 1st. So I wouldn't have to really, I'd be in custody of relatives before midnight, before the clock struck 12. And so.
That's crazy.
I know.
Well,
I guess it's crazy. I mean,
it is crazy.
Kids fly all the time across the country to be with other relatives. I don't know. I didn't think that was weird. I thought saving up my money and spending it on that might be considered weird.
You want to know what I spent my paper route money on? The most important thing I bought with my paper route money was a fog machine. That's what I bought. So.
Yeah. I would buy strange things, obviously, with the money not strange things, but, things that were along my lines of interest. But, I just thought, well, when am I ever going to have another chance to go to an opening of a Disney park? So, and I had been kind of telling myself all summer that I was going to do this. So I just wanted to go through with it. I didn't want to be one of these people that talks about doing something and then doesn't do it.
I love it. So you got that amazing history with Disney as a kid, going to the opening of Walt Disney World, which, I mean,
it was very short. It was, a very kind of flash in the pan. I only saw 1 or 2 news accounts of it, our local paper in Orange County, California. And then there was one in the Orlando Sentinel, I guess. And those are the only articles I ever saw about it. I remember being interviewed, but it seemed like forever when I got there, because I just wanted to get to the Magic Kingdom. But they, kidnapped me, so to speak. They sequestered me over to the Polynesian Hotel where they had their press operations set up. And so first I had to, do some on-camera interviews and recorded interviews, I think. And then finally we hopped on the monorail, and that was one more interview that I didn't even remember until someone recently sent me a copy that they got somehow from a local station. And now I'm looking at this video interview of me on the monorail on the way to the Magic Kingdom.
This story, so honestly, we could do an entire podcast about
Probably.
This individual story. So we're going to move on. But so you start there, going to opening of Walt Disney World. You end up working at Disneyland as a teenager, as a balloon seller, right?
That's right. Yeah. Weekends, while I was going through high school, and of course, summertime.
Was this 80s, early 80s, or what was it?
Late 70s. I started in the mid 70s, and then in 77, Disney took over the balloon concession, and I was a senior in high school, and so I became a Disney employee at that time, and then transferred into operations.
What was Disneyland like in the 70s? I feel like it was a slow time.
It was in the early 70s, I would say. It was, I think Walt Disney World was getting most of the love and attention, at least, from the treasury. So, at Disneyland, we were all like, when are we going to get something new? And there was Bear Band in Bear Country. That was kind of a little thing. And America Sings was kind of a little thing.
Isn't that why Main Street Electrical Parade headed over there too? It was kind of
72.
72. I feel like
yeah.
I've heard that like there was a little jealousy between the two resorts, and they're like, "We'll give you the Electrical Parade."
And it was it was a time where there wasn't very much change. It felt kind of inert. Like, okay, this is how it's going to be probably now forever. Like every 3 or 4 years there might be something. But I was used to it as a kid. Every time you went to Disneyland in the 60s, it's like, wasn't there something here last time? That was certainly true in Tomorrowland with exhibits. And it just seemed like it was changing more frequently. And there was always something, whether it was shops or restaurants or attractions, it was changing all the time. And then, it did kind of like go into this period where in some ways, it was kind of like not forlorn, but it was like, gee, is there, what happened to this ever changing quality? But also it was like it was being really carefully curated and preserved at the same time. Like, oh, no way would they ever change this or destroy that. And, that it's a double-edged sword, of course, because some things you want to go away and other things you don't necessarily want to. So that was kind of what the 70s was like. It was inert.
How did that hop from, working at Disneyland to Walt Disney Imagineering, WED Enterprises at the time, happen for you? Was it from one to the next, or was like there a period of time where you weren't working for Disney?
No, I was always working. I was always working for Disney since my freshman year in high school. And then 3 years, I believe, prior to that, or 2 years prior to that, I had a paper route. So I'd been working since I was 11 years old, basically.
So how'd that hop happen from Disneyland to Imagineering? And did you take a pay cut? Because I always hear people take the pay cut. It's so crazy.
But I did but I was lucky in my senior year of high school because when I went into operations, I think in the summertime of 77, I was granted a huge raise because the ride operators were part of the Teamsters, and the Teamsters insisted that my start date go back to the balloon start date. I'm sure they wouldn't have selected me to transfer if they knew that. Well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I think they were surprised when after that had happened. I had already transferred, and I couldn't care less about unions or Teamsters or pay. I was one of those people that was like, I can't believe I'm being paid to work here. I was making good money in my first 2 years of college. And so I took a pay cut when I went to WED Imagineering, only because I think I was making a lot, a disproportionate amount of money at Disneyland as a ride operator. That all came about because, to the great credit of the Disney Company, they foresaw this workload that was ahead of them. That was not only Epcot, but also Tokyo Disneyland, but also animation. They were trying to get the animation and the film departments kind of back up and running at the studio. And so they had developed a career planning and placement program at Disneyland and all divisions of Disney, I think. And it was really to cast a big net out there to see who they already had that was qualified to, go into other areas of the company, not just creatively, but I mean, they needed everything. They needed planners and project managers and schedulers and estimators and all of that, researchers, and they needed draftsmen. So that's where I came in because I had a pretty solid drafting portfolio from high school, from taking 3 years of it in high school. So I knew how to draft, and I had a good design sense that I had been trying to develop through illustration and sketching and that sort of thing. And I wanted to be a show designer, not a draftsman, but I wasn't at the time qualified to be a show designer, but they really needed draftsmen. And so they drafted me basically, along with, many others.
And you worked with some of the most iconic Imagineers around in that department.
I did, but I was very, again, just as I didn't want to be the little boy who flew to Disney World, I also didn't want to be kind of the salivating fanboy either. And I wish I had been a little bit more, so I could have gotten to know some of these guys and women a little bit more closely. But I did work a little bit with Claude Coates and very tangentially with Mark Davis and with Ward Kimball on World of Motion. And John Hench would, occasionally come by. Herb Ryman, whether you liked it or not, would come, knocking on your door. I didn't have a door. I had a cubicle, but he'd come in and offer his ideas and thoughts. And so, I did come into contact with these people, and it was, I felt very privileged to be able to even, talk to them briefly.
Did you ever hear them talking about Walt? Is that something that they were... I mean, it was over a decade since he'd passed, almost 2 at that point, I think. And I don't know, was he like a name that still came up in conversation, like a what would Walt do sort of scenario or anything like that?
Sometimes. I mean, Herbie would always tell just stories, anecdotes, and they would often involve Walt. But I don't remember him saying, Walt would do this or Walt wouldn't do that. That was a phrase I don't think you would hear too much. I think there was just kind of everyone knew, it seemed like, what was appropriate. It's the old John Hench thing that John Hench used to say, that the different designers had different lengths of leash on them. Mm-hmm. And they could all, if Walt was walking north, they could all wander and meander as long as their leash was. And as long as they were all generally heading north, they could go a little northeast or a little northwest. They just couldn't go south. And so I think everyone knew at the time innately what south was. And so you didn't really need to say it. But it was more, kind of, I don't know. I was always seeking just, advice, or just being near them. You would learn things, you would just learn by osmosis. It was really kind of the best, on the job training one could ever ask for. Also, the legends, let's call them, the company would occasionally have a program where you would weekly have a session with them. There'd be like 20 or 24 people in a room with Yale Gracie or with Bill Martin or John Hench, etc. I think there were like 20 of these individuals. Bill Evans, Herbie, of course, Mark Davis, Claude. And so those were important. And I retained a lot of what I heard in some of those sessions.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Early on in your tenure there, you did work on Epcot. The grand opening of Epcot,
right,
came in 1982. And of course, Epcot was this, it was this park about education. And it's obviously was a huge risk. But I'm curious, is that something that the team working on Epcot was thinking about or had fears about, the fact that it was going to be focused on education, not, animated characters necessarily? No,
I think there was a great belief by everyone in what we were doing. And I don't think we thought of it as being educational. It was more providing a model. It's Disney providing an example and inspiration to the audience, to their audience, to the world, to whoever would listen, about these ideas, on how we're going to save Spaceship Earth. So the younger folks like myself, I think, were drawn to WED in large part because of Epcot. I don't think as many people were as interested as working at Tokyo Disneyland or other projects as they were about the idea that Disney's going to help, not save the world, but, do its good deed, do what it can because it had the resources to do it. And that is to provide information in an entertaining way, and examples and solutions. So it's a kind of a living model for, how we can go about living better in the world, living with our international neighbors, our fellow passengers on Spaceship Earth. These were all like phrases, but that's what would pull us, if we were in college and we're trying to figure out what we're going to do for the rest of our lives. What career are we going to go into? There weren't a lot of choices at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. It was you became a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. And being an engineer meant probably working for Martin Marietta or McDonnell Douglas or, the defense industry. And that wasn't very appealing to a lot of us. The 70s was kind of the end of the kind of, establishment revolution and all of that. And the idea of working in the defense industry or working for some big multinational corporation. And back then, large corporations did not do as good of a job at making themselves feel warm and fuzzy. Mm-hmm. It was like, we are ITT, ITT, International. Oh, I can't even remember what ITT was. It was AT&T. ITT was this huge company. Fluor was this big, giant company that was near us in Orange County. I mean, there were all these just big, mega companies, even motion picture companies. Gulf Western International, that was Paramount.
Yeah.
So it just didn't sound appealing. Like, what were the choices? And suddenly there was this choice for those of us that, grew up in Orange County or the LA area and were working at Disneyland. This was a palatable career choice, for us, whether we were creative but I remember there were people who were into research and science and, engineering who were just like, Epcot, we want to work on Epcot.
Now, eventually a decision was made that the initial intent wasn't pleasing the crowds as much as maybe they wanted. So you started bringing in Disney characters and stuff. So as someone who was working on that original park with that original intent, did it kind of hurt to see that happening? Or was it just like, listen, people aren't showing up the way we need them to?
Well, I think they were showing up. I think they were getting a lot of feedback that they would like. Adults were enjoying it, but their kids were fidgety or whining because they couldn't see a particular character. So I kind of guessed that would happen, at some point, just being familiar with Disneyland, that you've got to have some, it makes sense to have some presence. To me, it wouldn't make sense just, to have an embargo on all characters. So I guess it was expected, and it would depend on the execution. I didn't like to see Mickey Mouse in that astronaut uniform that I thought looked silly, So I thought there could have been better ways to do some of that. But the notion of having some IP, was not was actually, I think, desired in many cases. We wanted to have some kind of a Tron attraction or presence in the park. And of course, the film didn't do well enough at the time to justify it. But, I remember everyone at Imagineering was always hoping that the next big Disney film would be a hit so that it would be something that we could use in one of the parks.
Gotcha.
And we went through that period where, it was kind of one disappointment after another.
You did work on an attraction, though, that ended up kind of creating a mascot for Epcot, and that is Journey into Imagination. And right. Figment is still huge today.
Yeah.
I mean, does that kind of blow your mind to think that, that's wild?
I guess I assumed that he would be popular at the time, and he maybe wasn't quite as popular in the first couple of years as I thought he would be. So it took a long time for it to grow, and it certainly did. But I knew, I kind of had a feeling at the time that, that this would be a classic character, and I didn't have any thought that the attraction would be changed as radically as it was. You always hope that there's change, but it's good, sensible, creative evolution, and not something that kind of radically changes the concept of the attraction.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I think of theme park attractions as somewhere between film and theater, where theater is so temporary and so fragile, and film is, quote unquote, forever if it doesn't deteriorate. Theme park attractions tend to last, tens of years. And so it's this weird placement of, oh, it'll always be here. But like in reality, it won't. And the original Journey into Imagination is one of those cases where, what was it? Just too technologically advanced? Did it keep breaking down or something? Like, why did it change?
I think it was just after a certain period of time, the Kodak partnership came up for renewal, and they were seeking something fresher, I guess. And now, whether they were satisfied or not, I don't know. I've heard stories to the contrary that they weren't satisfied, but I'm not close to any of that. I didn't have anything to do with Journey into Imagination once we completed the attraction and did some punch list items within the first year after it opened, through maybe the middle of 1984, and then I was done with Journey into Imagination for the rest of my career. So I didn't really follow its progress. I don't know if I even knew they were redoing it because I was so focused and involved with Disneyland Paris at the time that, I think one time I might have known kind of somewhere in the periphery that they were updating it, but I didn't know it had been so radically changed until I wrote it one time, when I was visiting Disney World on the way back from France, and was a little shocked.
Yeah, and so were a lot of people, and eventually Figment ended up back in it, but still quite different. Yeah. I'm lucky, I'm old enough to have done the original, and I have vivid memories of that original attraction, and loved it. And yeah, I'd say the only plus to it is that they worked Wayne Szalinski into the queue from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids.
Yeah.
Because I'm a huge Honey, I Shrunk the Kids fan. Other than that, I'm like, this didn't need to be changed. But anyway, I'm going to use your beautiful segue to head over to Disneyland Paris, originally, of course, Euro Disney, which once again, you opened another park. This was in 1992, and you were in charge of Fantasyland.
Right.
And my question is this: what's the approach when creating a new land based on an iconic existing land? Like, is there a lot of conversation about being original, but not being too original because people are expecting something?
Well, I came in a little late on the project, so I wasn't around for the initial discussions about content for it. But my impression was that it wasn't one of the areas that they wanted to have, necessarily be radically different in terms of what was in it. In other words, it would have basically what the other parks have, 4 or 5, different dark rides. It's a Small World, Teacups, and Dumbo. So I think that was the assumption. And when I got the project about a year later, the design still had not been wrapped up or anything, but the menu had been kind of established that it was going to have Peter Pan, Snow White, and Pinocchio, and not Mr. Toad, and not Alice in Wonderland. And it would have Teacups and Dumbo and a train station. And so when I took a close look at it, the menu was not an issue for me. It was wanting to make sure that it had a feeling a little bit more, storybook feeling, village feeling, more trees, more water. When I think of like a Pinocchio village, I think of a stream running through it. That's a little bit more magical, more appealing, and maybe we can arrange these little neighborhoods so that there's a Great Britain neighborhood, a French neighborhood, a Germanic neighborhood, etc. And I know they wanted to sell, one of the things that was high on the list was that there'd be a big pizza restaurant. And so I thought, well, then we can have an Italian area, for that. And so it was really kind of the way the land was laid out. I was pushing for Mr. Toad because that was my favorite of the dark rides. And it being not a top Disney animated film in terms of eyeballs that had seen it, it didn't make the cut. But I remember verbally proposing, I may have done the roughest of layouts for an indoor-outdoor version of Mr. Toad, and it would come crashing into the Toad Hall, back into Toad Hall at the end of the ride. And
that's cool.
Yeah. And so, in fact, there might even still be space for it on the berm between the train station and Pirates of the Caribbean. And so that idea didn't get very far. But then I thought, well, Mr. Toad is such a really cool, the Toad Hall is so cool. That's like one of the places I always wanted to live in Storybook Land. And there was a restaurant that we had on the menu for Fantasyland. It was kind of, nondescript. It was Captain Hook's Galley or something like that. And it was in the preliminary sketches that I saw for it were not anything that you would remember. Nice. It was, some half timbered structure, but, nothing you would like go out of your way to take a picture of or anything. And so I proposed, instead of making it a fish and chips, pirate themed restaurant, you could make it fish and chips, but Toad Hall. And we have the plans for it. It wouldn't be wouldn't be a new design on the exterior. You'd have to, on the interior, of course, shuffle things around. But so they bought into that idea. And also around this time, I think Michael Eisner had inquired about the possibility of doing a Hedge Maze, just as kind of an incidental kind of filler. Not really something that you would necessarily marquee as an attraction, but I thought, having experienced a couple of them on my trips to Europe, I thought, well, that's kind of a neat idea. Let's look into that. So we started playing around with that. Also, I was told kind of hands off of the castle because we already got several people looking into different ideas and designs for the castle, and they were already charging up a lot of money for that, I guess. And Tony Baxter, the creative lead for the entire project, did not want to have another person toiling away on it, and running up a huge expense on the design. So I kind of watched on the sidelines and watched, and Tony was not satisfied with what any of these 6 or 7 people were doing. And so I said, I'd love to work on it. And he said, well, if you do anything on it, you have to do it on your own after work. And so I worked out some little scribbles and some ideas, and he seemed to like the idea. And so we took it a little bit further and presented it eventually to Michael and Frank, and they bought into this idea, this general look. And then we were off and running and building a model of it.
I have said this many times on this podcast. I'm not saying this just because you're here. I love that castle so much. It is my favorite Disney castle. I've only been, as far as overseas parks, I've only been to Disneyland Paris, so I haven't seen them all in person. But I can say, I'm pretty sure that if I saw them all in person still, that castle is stunning. Like, it's so,
I hear
it's
that
so
a lot.
different.
I hear it
so
a lot.
different. The whole park in general
Right.
is gorgeous. And I know it wasn't a cheap park, but my gosh, it was just done right. And
yeah, I think so. And it wasn't that expensive. It went over a little bit, but it wasn't a disaster, or anything like that in terms of going over budget. The whole project, of course, went over budget for a number of reasons. And then there was the operating costs, which was the other thing when you add to it, that caused financial problems for the first few years. But in terms of hitting the budget on the Disneyland park, I think it didn't go over very much over the budget. People think it did because it's so elaborate, but I think the money was sensibly spent on it.
Now, when you're there working on that park, how aware were you of the kind of protests and stuff going on in France that they weren't?
It was stuff that was written about in newspapers more than it was things that you actually witnessed.
Okay.
So, and it would, the things that we witnessed were stupid things like taxi drivers, blocking the road or something because they wanted a higher cut. Or they tended to be labor reasons, not cultural reasons. Yes, someone said something about it being a cultural Chernobyl, and that stuck, over time. But that was one person's comment, and it was certainly not anything you saw from the general public.
What was it like being in a park in general that isn't open yet, that's under construction? Like, is it a kind of a weird feeling, or is there a panic of, oh my gosh, is this ever going to get finished? Like, how are you guys feeling with Disneyland Paris when you're sitting there in a half complete park? Like, yeah. It's got to be like Twilight Zone-esque, I would imagine.
It is. I mean, I kind of got inoculated, through Epcot on that, because there were periods of time on Epcot where you just went, oh my God, there's no way.
Yeah.
What are they doing? They're pouring cement, and it's 5 days before opening. But I would say the weather was really the thing that was, you couldn't predict what the weather was going to do. And I think, there were a couple of winters there where just everything would almost stop because it was so cold. It was ice, things were icing up, and you can't really work when it gets to a certain, when you've got wind and freezing cold and drizzle. It makes it very difficult to make progress. Also very difficult I think the fear was really more that, how do we get out there in the middle of this? We're trying to make a decision, and it's physically impossible because you can't look at things objectively, or even, there's just too much wind, or it's too dark and you're trying to select colors, or you're trying to figure out where, landscaping is going to go. That, I think, was the thing that was a little scary. Like, okay, the construction is going to keep moving. It's going to keep going. They're going to keep pouring cement. How are we going to keep up with the construction and make sure that everything is, goes in right?
And now 30 years later, I mean, the park still looks spectacular. I mean, is it your favorite castle? I know that's a little bit of a biased question.
I tried to remain objective about it for a long time, because my oath to myself when I started working on it was, I just want it to be as good as the Disneyland and the Walt Disney World castles. That's all I ask, is that it be as good as those. Because I did feel it needed to be different, that each park should have its own identity, and that's partly through how the castle appears. And so I never really agreed with duplicating the castle for Tokyo, for example, as nice as that castle is. So I was very adamant, on a personal level, that it be a different castle. And I only stepped in because I knew what it was that Tony wanted. And so I stepped in, and it's just like, please just make this as good as, I don't want to be embarrassed by having not lived up to the Disneyland castle or the Walt Disney World castle.
Well, you got your way with Disneyland Paris, but then you opened yet another park, Hong Kong Disneyland, which did eventually get a duplicate of Disneyland's castle. But true or false, was it supposed to be a flat castle at one point?
Well, no, it was going to be it was proposed that it be done in the It's a Small World facade style at Disneyland. So not really flat, but but more interpretational, and it was kind of an interesting idea, given that it was not supposed to be a Disneyland park yet. It wasn't called Disneyland at the time. It was Disney's Magical Adventure or something.
Oh, I didn't realize that. When Hong Kong Disneyland opened, they weren't calling it Hong Kong Disneyland?
Oh, no, when it opened, yes. But the initial idea for it grew out of the idea of doing a regional park.
Gotcha.
A smaller regional experience that was not a Disneyland, and it kept growing. And at some point, you've got to say, okay, it's starting to look like a Disneyland, so you've got to make it a Disneyland now.
Gotcha.
So in that kind of in between period, it was proposed that someone did. I thought it was an interesting idea of it being kind of it's a small world style castle.
I say. Now, one of the things I love about reading stuff about you and your interviews and such is you're very honest, and you talk about the times when the company cut corners and such, and Hong Kong Disneyland was one of those times. And I'm just curious, you just went from, or I shouldn't say just went from, but you had worked on Disneyland Paris, which had, a large budget, to Hong Kong Disneyland, which didn't. And do you feel like some sort of shame, for lack of a better term, or an embarrassment when you're working on something that clearly isn't getting the financial love that maybe the Imagineers want it to?
No, because you can always do the best possible job you can with a given budget. What's going to suffer is the scope of, the number of attractions or the size. Well, that was the situation with Hong Kong Disneyland. So we opened up a beautiful, beautiful park for what we had the money for. And we had all wished that we could have had more attractions on opening day. But what was there was done absolutely beautifully. Everyone did a fantastic job, the hotels too. And I would say the one that, I could maybe personally say is embarrassing, although, we all gave it our best shot and we all had to be good soldiers, because we were still in this era post Euro Disneyland of, we're not building any more theme parks. That's a mature business now. So we're going to focus on these regional entertainment ideas. And that was a notion for about 3 or 4 or 5 years before suddenly these, the theme parks started growing out of some of these regional park or regional entertainment ideas. And so Hong Kong was one of those. So also was the second park for Paris, which by contractual agreement, it was in the contract that Disney build the second park or lose the land. But they were still in this, we're not doing theme parks anymore. And I had suggested and done a presentation on what would be a half-day experience, not a park per se, but a half-day experience that could grow into a park. Think Knott's Berry Farm, where it starts as one thing, and then without destroying that one thing, it grows into something bigger. And that was the idea behind that. And they loved the idea, but the next day they said, no, but we're going to charge full day admission, so it's going to be a full day park. I'm like, well, how are you going to do that with, on this very challenging budget? So we did the best we could with that. And we did do some really nice shows, Cinemagique and, I think the Animation Pavilion. There were some good moments for it, but that was, probably the nadir of that whole experience of, we're not doing any more theme parks, but here, do this thing that kind of crawls towards being a theme park.
Yeah, there's a great quote from you in the Imagineering story on Disney Plus where you say that Imagineers were encouraged to forget who we were. And that's the period of time you're talking about. There was the focus on real estate, entertainment, retail, dining. And I don't know, at that point, I mean, you'd been at Imagineering for a while, but does the work lose the fun at that point? Or do you just, I'm sure Imagineering's full of a lot of optimistic people. Are you just like, well, the work's changed? Like,
yeah. There's always the thought that, you still got Disneyland, Walt Disney World, Magic Kingdom, Epcot, Tokyo Disneyland. Those all have things we can go back to and build wonderful attractions for.
Okay.
And, doing these second gates that were a little bit smaller was just kind of in service to the overall health, I guess, of the individual resorts. So, I think, you just kind of soldiered along and because you didn't know, where things were necessarily going. I remember when I started at Imagineering in 1979, there was no guarantee that after Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland that there would be any more parks or in Imagineering. And in fact, I was encouraged to take the job in 1979 versus finishing college and entering the market in 1981 or 1982. And more than one person said, we don't know if there's going to be, a WED Enterprises after that. So if you want to do this, now's the time to do it. So that was kind of always in the back of my head that, this may not be forever. It may not be a forever thing.
And I know that a lot of times jobs at Imagineering are per project, and a lot of people, get laid off after their project's complete. You eventually got to a position, I would assume, where that was not a concern for you, or were you always kind of in that situation as well, where there had to be a next project for you?
I think for the first few years, I felt fairly safe because I was new. I was not at the top of the pay scale there, so in some regards, that makes you a little safer.
Yeah.
And I knew that, it wasn't just Tony Baxter, but Randy Bright and Marty and other folks seemed to like what I was doing because I was very versatile. By then I was not just a drafts person. I could write. I was doing ride layouts. I could do architectural design, though I was not an architect. And so I think that kind of made me safe because I was, I also I dabbled in other people's business, more than others. So that meant getting involved with music and graphics and color and all of that.
There does seem to have been a period of time at Imagineering where, being a jack of all trades was just the norm for everybody there. You had to pick up things even if you didn't know how to paint a model or whatever. It's like, go do it. And these days it feels much more specialized. Everybody has a very specialized skill that they're there for. I feel like you would have been there during that transition. Did you feel that transition or am I talking nonsense?
I could never tell if what I was feeling was real. So I did start to feel that it was transitioning in the last 5 to 10 years that I was there, that my involvement in other silos was less appreciated, and also that noticing it seemed like other people were having more difficulty kind of, moving around silo to silo, and yet others could still do it. So I couldn't really tell, is it just my imagination, or is this really happening? So, and it could be something that's cyclical too. So,
yeah.
I know that certainly any smart management welcomes flexibility
yeah,
and malleability and a jack of all trades kind of approach, but in enforcing it is a different thing. So, in some cases, it may be that they don't necessarily know how to enforce it or how to best enforce it.
This might be a really tough question that you don't want to answer, so feel free to say pass. But okay. Where do you feel Imagineering is today? We've talked about the highs and the lows of Imagineering and everything being cyclical. Where do you think they are right now?
Well, it's hard to say because it, like I said, it was always cyclical. There was, it's always the best of times, the worst of times. So I remember people nagging and complaining and whining when I started.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, what are you whining about? This is a wonderful, place. But it isn't like what it was when Walt was here, or it wasn't, like it was even 5 years ago. So you never know. It's kind of hard to suss through all of that. And I just think it's something that has always, it's very management sensitive. So if you get the right group of management together, the right combination, I think it works well in it, and things tend to work out for the best, if you will. But when you get management, different levels of management, and they're at odds with one another, that's where the, problems start. And that was the problem, not at Imagineering within Imagineering. It was more within the upper levels of the Walt Disney Company in the 90s after Disneyland Paris opened, and you heard these silly things like, we're out of the theme park business now.
Yeah. Which is so funny to think that those words, it's like saying, we're not doing animation anymore.
Well, I remember hearing that. So, I kind of became, as I was working at Disneyland, I'm a ride operator at Disneyland, and I'm hearing, they're going to shut down animation, or they're thinking about it, and they're not going to do any more attractions at Disneyland. It's all going to be Walt Disney World and Tokyo Disneyland now. And you just hear these things and you go, well, that can't be true,
Yeah.
Or maybe it is.
Yeah.
And you kind of prepare yourself for the maybe it is. And then eventually, I mean, who would have thought that the animation would have rebounded as strongly as it did? And then the live action films would bounce back, because that was the thing that took the longest amount of time was live action Disney films being something that, was palatable and not embarrassing to go to.
Yeah. Obviously the theme parks, as far as attendance goes, seems to be bigger than ever, and you have people repeating their visits over and over and over to the parks. Was there a change in, as far as your time at Imagineering, where toward the end of your career, you felt like these attractions are being built for repeat riders more so than when you first started working there?
No, because I think we always thought of repeat.
Okay, cool. So even when
always.
People, okay.
At least for me and the people that I immediately worked with, it was always about make sure this is something you want to go on, 10, 20 times and see and experience it. See something new every time. My philosophy for things about change, for example, Pirates of the Caribbean, my favorite attraction, the one at Disneyland, for mostly nostalgic reasons, but I think there is also a mystique and a certain alchemy to it that makes it work. But it doesn't, in my mind, mean that you don't change anything ever in it. And, that's one attraction that I would love to see, just slightly different scenarios taking place in some of those, in some of the scenes, just, because the environment is so strong. Changing the business that the characters are doing would enhance that, only enhance it. It wouldn't take the environmental quality of it away. It would just give you something to look forward to maybe the next time you ride it, like, just having different dialogue and slightly different programming animation, and different characters appear, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. In addition to the base, scope of it. I think that's something that would enhance Pirates of the Caribbean. I know there's people who think that's blasphemy, but as long as you don't change the environment, because that's what's so strong. It's environmentally so magical that, I wouldn't want to go through the Blue Bayou, for example, and it's daytime and there's no fireflies, whatever, It's a swamp fire. It's a swamp fire going on.
Oh, man. Is true or false? Are you a huge part of the reason why we have synchronized sound on roller coasters?
Yeah, very much.
How did this come about? Because, to me, that's game changing.
Well, it took about 10 years to convince people of it. So I just always, always had, from the time I was 16 years old, I had my own car with my own, tape deck. And I loved listening to my favorite songs on my drive, for example, from Newport down to San Juan Capistrano, and you drive through Laguna. And the PCH goes up and down, and it winds around, and it reveals a new scene. And I just, whether it was the Eagles or, whatever crappy bands I was listening to back then, like Styx, it was just thrilling to get a certain kind of synchronicity happening between what I was looking at, what I was physically feeling in the car, and hearing. And it seemed to me that it was the Disney Company was formed with synchronization. It's been about the marriage of music and motion from the very beginning. And so in 1985, I think it was 1985, I was sent down to Disneyland to get some site experience at the Imagineering office there. A good thing for all Imagineers to do, to spend some time in the local office and see how people really, see how guests really respond and react and behave in the park to the things that you design. And so I spent 2 years, I think it was 2 years, nearly 2 years down there. And one of the things I would do after work, because I wanted to pitch this idea of fully synchronized onboard audio. And I in my mind, it was working towards a kind of rock and roller coaster idea. But I would use Space Mountain as the demo for it. And I would take a Sony Walkman. I was able to create a timing profile, a timing sheet, an exposure sheet, if you will, that predicated how you could organize a song around the ride experience of Space Mountain at Disneyland. And so I came up with several different soundtracks that I would demo, and the ride operators were really into it. The lead on the attraction was into it. He'd let me ride it around and around at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day when it wasn't as crowded. And so I would do these demos. I think first person I took on maybe was Tony, or maybe someone from the local SQS office there. And then I worked my way up through management there and took supervisors through it. And they all liked it. Someone at Imagineering, shockingly, didn't.
What?
Yeah.
They should be fired.
It's, a wonderful person, and I'm not going to say who it is, but I was shocked because for this person, they found that it was scary, that it made it scarier.
Well, good.
And this was a very macho person, let me put it that way.
That's so funny.
His lack of enthusiasm, I think, kind of stalled it for a while. And so then, I got to working on Disneyland Paris and everything. But when the idea, would occasionally surface, I was pushing it as a new attraction for one of the parks as a rock and roller coaster. And I had Dave Minichello do some illustrations for it. And it was gaining interest, but no one quite willing to take the risk to spend, the tens and tens of millions of dollars. But we had a good opportunity to begin demoing the idea. First, Ed Sato, who was the executive creative guy for a while down at Disneyland, really liked the idea. And so I think he was the first to actually institute it, if I'm not mistaken, when he brought in Dick Dale to do that wonderful soundtrack for Space Mountain at Disneyland. And we proposed it for Space Mountain in Paris. So I was nudging Tim Delaney, who didn't need too much nudging because he loved the idea as well. And so we hired a composer to come up with a new score for the one in Paris. And also, but where it was technically, from an engineering standpoint, first demoed and first opened, I believe, was Casey Jr. Circus train at Disneyland Paris, which was an electric train. It was a power coaster that looks just like the one at Disneyland. And because it's a powered coaster, you don't have the squash and stretch timeline that you might otherwise have. And so it was really an exercise to see how sturdy and reliable an onboard sound system could be with all of the twists and turns and sudden stops or whatever. That was the first one that you could call technically the fully synchronized onboard audio. And then the two Space Mountains were pretty close, I think, in their openings.
What was the music that you used when you tested it on Casey Jr.? Did I hear this correctly?
No, it was Casey Jr.
Oh, okay.
It was the same soundtrack.
I heard something about you tested something with the score of E.T.
That was what I was using. It was one of the ones I was using. It was the most effective one that I was using for the Disneyland demos that I was doing in the 80s.
Wow.
When I take, I'd have to have a special jack to put in my Sony Walkman so that two people could listen to it, and then that it dampened the volume, it was like, everything was like so frustrating to demo. But I had kind of new wave music and E.T. and the Black Hole. The Black Hole worked really great on all of the inclines. It didn't work well at all on the declines. But the anticipation that was built in that John Barry score worked really well on the lifts. And then I just had, Devo and all of the Duran Duran and, New Order, all of the usual suspects from the 80s.
Well, I will say on behalf of all of us, thank you for that, because honestly, I can't imagine roller coasters without synchronized sound these days. Like, it just feels so... Well,
I wish they would do it. I would love to hear like a banjo or a bluegrass thing on Big Thunder, or just yodeling, on the Matterhorn.
Yeah.
Just that track that they used to play.
You never know. I'm going to wrap this up because I know you got to go. Thank you so much for giving me your time. But I'm curious, is there a project that when you left Imagineering that was being worked on that you wished you could have been part of?
Yeah, but I can't remember right now what it was. I was working on like 4 or 5 different things. And
so you were working on stuff that kind of got that you had to leave.
Yes, but in the last year, they had me focused on synergy projects, which were a lot of small and big things. And so that's probably the kind of bucket of things that, some of those ideas were really neat and others, were so-so or, just kind of temporary. One that I really enjoyed, but it was more like 3 or 4 years prior, was another seasonal event that was going to be added to Epcot that was going to kind of bring in some of the original Epcot thinking along with the latest thinking from all of those various topics in a way that would add something new to the park each year. And maybe someday that'll happen, but that was the one that I had a lot of interest in.
If it does happen, I'm sure food booths will be involved. Probably. And it'll be festival of something.
we had bio. Now I'm forgetting all of the terms, but it was food that was tailored to your DNA. So if you were Scandinavian or, had an Asian background, here is a menu that is optimized for your DNA.
Huh.
So, the Mediterranean diet, the Asian diet, the Scandinavian diet, etc.
Interesting.
So that was one idea that involved food. And, who knows, maybe some of these things. It seems like every single thing I've ever worked on, proposed, has come back in, one way or another.
Yeah. Do you want to tell the folks about the Disney Editions book you're working on, or do you got to
Well, it's not Disney Editions.
Oh, I thought it was going to be Disney Editions. No.
They have some oversight, but because it's so specialized, it is being done through the Hyperion Historical Alliance.
Oh, nice.
It's a non-profit group of Disney historians and Disney employees, Disney family members, producers, directors, authors. And so they work in cooperation with the Disney Company and the Disney Archives and the different Disney business units. They produce the books that are a little more idiosyncratic. And so I wanted to get started right away, and they were willing to start it right away. And that was over 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago now. And it started out as one idea, and it morphed into another idea. And because I was shocked at how much information I bumped into in the rabbit holes about Imagineers who I had never heard of, Imagineering stories, Imagineering history that I was unaware of, and that I think everyone at Imagineering is unaware of because it's never been told or never been shown. I like to show. And I'm also a lot about where. Where did this happen? Where was this photo taken? Where did they do this? And after decades of seeing photographs, sometimes you see some of the same photographs over and over, yet you don't get any new information in those photographs. And there's like, well, who's this person who's with Walt and Harper Goff on a early Jungle Cruise boat before the park opened? Who's that man in, overalls with a cap? And you find out, oh, he's a very famous person. Not in the celebrity world, but in the world of engineering and in the world of World's Fairs and things like that. And so almost every day that I'm doing research, I came up with, here's where this photo was taken. Who's in this photo? Who is that person? What did they do? What did they do after Disney? What did they do before Disney? They may have worked on The Wizard of Oz. They may have won multiple Academy Awards after they worked at Disney or Emmys or, so it's, I thought, and some of these people are still alive. They're in their 80s and 90s. So I thought, you know what? Someone's got to do this now.
And I will say, for folks who this book sounds interesting to, you should obviously keep your eye out for that. But for now, follow you on Twitter at Tom K. Morris, because you post a lot of great content.
I try to post things that are, not the typical thing. If I'm going to post, an anniversary or someone's birthday, it's not going to be, Herb Ryman's birthday, or it's going to be one of these people that you've never heard of. But it's becoming harder and harder for me to post because I'm under NDA, and my bucket of things that I can post on Twitter is drying up quickly, while the other bucket of like, oh my God, this is going to blow people away, I can't post that stuff right now. So.
I still just love your collectibles. Like, I think you posted a cassette of the on-ride audio for like Indiana Jones Adventure, stuff like that. It's just like, oh my gosh.
I'm going to have to go to my closet or back into old photos to have content to post, because, oh, believe me, I am itching and chomping at the bit to post some of these things, but I can't.
Yeah.
And they're things that would blow you away.
Well, I look forward to the book. Tom, thank you so much for doing this. I know you're super, super busy, and I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. Hopefully we touched upon some stuff you don't talk about constantly, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Sure. And we could do it again anytime. Just, let me know.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Disney with a Z, coast to coast, on your favorite podcast app. In this episode, you heard Tom discuss his love of Pirates of the Caribbean. If you love that ride as well, head on over to Souvenir Scents to get their Pirate Ride candle in order to fill your home with the scents of one of your favorite attractions. Simply click on the Souvenir Scents link in this episode's description, and be sure to use code DCTC at checkout in order to save 15% off of your entire order. This episode has been executive produced by Robert Scontrino. Gain rewards like Robert, including access to never-before-heard episodes and live stream Q&As by visiting the Patreon link in this episode's description. Basically, anything you need can be found in this episode's description. From additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!
Thanks for listening to Disney Coast to Coast. Have a magical day.
Disney Coast to Coast is produced and hosted by Jeff DePauli. Learn more about the podcast and become a supporter at DisneyCoastToCoast.com. This podcast is part of the DePodcast Network. Learn more about this show, plus find more quality and entertaining podcasts at DePodcastNetwork.com. That's DEPodcastNetwork.com.